All right, so next up we have Connor Campbell from BattleCry Studios to represent what some of the Modo games customers have been doing recently with the tool. Connor has worked at a number of different studios in his career so far. He's currently down in Austin, Texas, and does mostly prop modeling, environment modeling. Worked on the latest version of Doom and some environments there as well. So without further ado, I'm going to let Connor take you through some of the cool stuff that he does with Modo and games. Thanks, Connor.
All right. Thank you, Shane. Hey guys, I'm Connor McCampbell. I've been working in the film and game industry for a little over 4 years now, and I've had the opportunity to work with pretty much every single 3D package in a professional capacity, and I'm here today to talk about why I think Modo is the best one for real-time art. So these are just a small subset of companies that I personally know of, just to give you an idea of how prolific Modo has become in the game industry. And these are just some studios that are either using it for content creation or as their primary 3D package with direct engine integration. At BattleCry, we recently had the chance to work with id on the latest Doom, and this is some of the work that we've done with them. So id uses Modo heavily in world building and asset creation and level design. And it's a cool thing to note that everything in these images right here was built entirely within Modo and then exported as just a couple chunks to build up the entire level in Doom. This asset right here is actually made using just a bunch of primitive geometry and booleans and bevels, and one of my favorite features in Modo, which is the rounded edge shader, which I'll be going into detail about a little bit later. This gun was made using Mesh Fusion, which you saw Kevin and Ed talk a little bit about earlier for when you need to create sub-D geometry and keep it really highly editable and live for iterating. Super powerful workflow. And these last two models right here were also made using the rounded edge shader, which is actually fully bakeable down to low-res geometry to create game-ready assets too. So it's a super powerful workflow to be able to keep things really lightweight and editable, but still end up with a game-res mesh. So why Modo? What about Modo makes the software so conducive to creating real-time art? First and foremost, it's absolutely, objectively the most artist-friendly 3D package there is. And a large part of that is because of its best-in-class modeling and UVing tools. If you're involved in creating art for games in any capacity, you know how much of time that actually takes up. So it's an incredibly important thing to have. So things like the selection tools, action centers for pivot control, work plane to be able to create and pull geometry off of any normal, fall-offs, which is a more powerful version of lattice tools or freeform deform tools that can be stacked and combined with their tools. Integrated sculpting tools, which are actually fantastic and work really well. I'll be going into detail about those a little bit later too and how we use some of those on Doom. Automatic retopology, which is basically Dynamesh right inside of Modo. It's fantastic. Powerful booleans, being able to just work with all of this stuff in a modern and clean user interface that's consistent is great too. And the freedom to work with ingons and just irregular geometry while having your mesh retain all of its properties and not become unworkable is really liberating. Macro creation is another one of my favorite things, where everyone in here, you can basically be your own programmer without having to know any scripting knowledge at all. The rounded edge shader, screen space activated tools so you don't have to snipe out geometry to move things on certain axes, and cutting and pasting. All these things are just fantastic. And everything over here on the right is just an honest bonus. Being able to fly through your environment with WASD navigation like you would in the engine, the game tools tab, one-to-one parity between materials in Modo and engines. So this right here is my favorite workflow of all of them. This is just using the rounded edge shader. So that's what it looks like. It's just some booleans, geometry crashing together, and this is ultimately what it looks like when you go to render it in Modo's renderer. And the best thing about this is it's super easy to work with and it's fully bakeable down to low-res geometry. So you can use this in a game workflow too. So this is a little bit more of a complicated example of something I'm working on right now. It's currently a work in progress. But this is exclusively utilizing the rounded edge shader. There's not a single piece of sub-D geometry in this entire thing. So you can really kind of start to see how powerful it is to be able to basically make a blockout mesh, have that also be your high-res version, and be able to just go over in the Modo render preview and get an idea of what your mesh will look like with those nice rounded edges that a bake would give you without having to even make high-res surface geometry. And this is what the geo for that looks like. So not what you'd expect. It's super simple to work with, it's lightweight, and it's really easy to go forward and backward and iterate on this stuff too. And so this is just an example of what this process looks like and what it looks like to work with the rounded edge shader. So all we're doing here is just doing some bevels, not worrying about ingons, booleans. We're just going to cut some stuff in here, do a couple more bevels right inside of that, cut a couple more shapes out, and all of this stuff, none of this matters. You don't need to ever have any kind of a thought about topology or anything. Modo takes care of everything for you. And that's it right there. So that's all you need to do. And we're going to go over a little bit more of a complex example of that later on and learn how to bake that down to low-res geometry, which is a super simple workflow too. So, you might traditionally think that it's hard to step back and, you've done a bunch of Booleans and stuff, and now your geometry is unusable and you've got to start deleting stuff or starting over. But that's absolutely not true with Modo. And in fact, I'm only using one tool here to just completely obliterate all the geometry that I've added or subtracted onto this surface. So this is a really good way to step back through your mesh, change things, not feel afraid to make cuts or changes or Booleans. And it's also a good way to make a low-res version of whatever you're working on for when you're actually getting to the point where you're ready to put it in engine, bake it down, make a low-res game version. And I'm only using about 3 or 4 different tools here to do all this stuff. This one right here is one of my favorites. I use this all the time when I'm making low-res geometry for games. Unbevel, just unbevels everything perfectly. And so I just want to talk really quickly about scene and mesh management. This is something that I think is kind of just really underappreciated in Modo. It's super simple but awesome. So this is the way I build all my scenes right here. Is I'll have my standard mesh layer on the left, and I'll have an instance of it on the right. And instead of having to go through any kind of attaching, detaching, combining, separating with a bunch of dirty history and stuff, all you have to do is just click the layer that you want to create geometry in and start making geometry. And if you want to move it between layers, just cut and paste. So macros is another huge thing that I've been using lately more and more at work. Basically what this is it just lets you, just like a Photoshop action, you can start recording something, perform a bunch of different actions, and save that out as a macro. So this really empowers anyone and everyone just to be able to make their own scripts and speed up their own workflow in a bunch of different ways. So right here I just made one that will automatically, without even doing one single click, just select all the hard edges on a geometry and bring me right into the UV window where I can go ahead and just start laying that stuff out. And that's all there is to it. And so right here, I've made a separate macro that will take geometry that's underneath whatever my cursor is hovering over, copy it without even clicking, and I'll hover my mouse over another piece of geometry, and without even clicking again, I'll just press my hotkey and it will duplicate and propagate those UVs across different pieces of geometry. So that's something that's super useful when you're doing stuff like modular building and games, when you've got UVs that you're going to propagate across a high poly mesh or something. So let's just see how you bake that stuff down. So I've taken the door out of that rendered example right there, and we're just going to go through and use some of Modo's selection tools and other tools to see how we're going to make a low-res version of that and bake that geometry down. So what you're seeing right here is actually that's the high poly geometry right there. It's just a bunch of, it's just geo crashed another geo, ingons, just a bunch of bevels. And so right here we're just using Modo's step tool, which is a tool that just will it'll select the next logical step after 2 components that you selected. It's great for creating low polys too. That right there is it's an align to furthest of left, right, up, or down, but based on what you're looking at your screen, which is one of the best tools I've ever used. I've known people that completely made the switch to Modo based on just one tool like that alone. So it really is just a matter of finding that one thing that really just wows you and running with it. So right here we'll just continue on deleting a few more edges, making this low poly. And that is, so we'll take this and just do a quick additive Boolean. Nothing got ruined there. The geometry is all preserved. Everything is still perfectly functional. We'll just weld those verts together to create one solid airtight mesh. And delete these final 2 edges right here to finish our low poly out. And that's it right there. That's so that's going to work for our low poly. So for the UV tools right here, these are absolutely one of the best parts of Modo for me. Super easy to use. I have all of my UV tools that I use. I use about 4 total, and I have them all in a pie menu. So right here, this one in particular, You can take anything and just make it a perfect rectangle, perfectly spaced edges, and perfectly unfolded. That's something that's completely invaluable for doing stuff like strip texturing when you're working in games and you have a lot of modular textures with different broken up sections that you need to wrap across a bunch of geometry. Super handy, super useful. We'll do the same thing right here too. Just make those into nice rectangles right away, one click. It works every single time. And so the way I unwrap a lot of my stuff is I'll just go ahead and select edges and just run the unwrap command, and it will make my shells. And all I have to do, run the rectangle tool or run a relax, and then just orient and pack, which will automatically shape my UV shells proportional to the X or Y axis. So we're just doing the same thing right here, a little bit more of that, and we're going to run the command on this. And I'm going to go in here and clean up a couple of the triangles. Super easy, just using the same command that I was using on that Boolean object earlier to clean up the geometry. What it does is just combines everything into whatever you have selected. It's called the polymerge command. It's fantastic too. And we'll just make those into rectangles and finish out our low poly UVs with this right here. So this is another really cool thing is you can use face selections to add to your edge selections. So it's something I'll do a lot is I'll select a loop of faces and then grow that selection and then convert that to edges and keep adding edges on top of that, going back and forth between faces and edges. And that's it for the low poly UVs. I think I just split this in half just to get a little bit more resolution out of this pack, and that's it. So we're going to step through the baking process now, which is also incredibly easy and super streamlined in Modo 10. So the first thing we'll do is just run a quick script right there, and it converts all of your UV border edges to hard edges. Just one button, built right in. Right here, we're going to make our cage. All you do is make a new morph map, click on it, and run the push tool directly on top of your low poly. This is the low poly that we're baking to right here. So all you have to do is just click back and forth, that's it. No managing an external cage file or exporting another FBX. And so we'll come back in here, make a new bake item. We set our target meshes and source meshes, which is the high poly, and we'll come over in here, and in the low poly material, which is the material assigned to the low poly mesh, we're just going to add an image, which is going to be what our bake gets saved on top of. So right here, we'll rename the bake item door bake, select our cage, and select the image that we're going to be baking the normal map on top of. And just check all these boxes. And that's all there is to it. And then we just run bake selected right there, after we make sure that we have our high poly material set on our high res, which has our rounded edge value. And that's it. Normal map, normal bake just from that alone. So we'll come over here, hide the high poly, and assign the low poly material, and you can see it's got perfectly baked edges as if you had made a high poly mesh for this, except you didn't have to go through the trouble of figuring out topology and breaking that stuff all down to a low res mesh. It's a drastically underappreciated workflow that I think a lot more people need to embrace and know about. So this right here, this is using some of that same automatic retopology stuff that Kevin showed us earlier. If you wanted to make a low poly for this, you quite literally just pull it up and press OK, and there you go, you're done. So there's no going to other programs, there's no manual retopology, you don't have to save earlier versions of something that you did then. That's it, you're done, you're good to go. And you'd use the exact same process to UV and bake this thing too. And so finally, I just want to talk a little bit about the sculpting tools in Modo because they're actually super useful. The brushes in here are great. I think there's about 7 or 8 over here on the left-hand side, and honestly, that's about how many you use anyway. It's got alpha support, but all we're going to do right here is just take a low-res mesh and just kind of start pushing and pulling some stuff around to kind of make a little bit of a rock shape that we're going to use for cutting. And so we're not too worried about getting any cool details out of here, just kind of worried about the overall silhouette. So right here, we'll just add a couple more subdivisions, and there we go. So then we'll take the jitter tool and just add a little bit of undulation into that so it gets a little bit more of a rocky type of look and shape. Duplicate this, and using that same Boolean workflow that we used earlier to get that nice hard surface high-res mesh, we'll just do that same thing right here. Just cut that Boolean right out of that mesh. Do the same thing right here, add a couple more cuts to get some more variation into the shape so we can use this to cut other geometry. We're going to create damage pillars with this. And so right here, we'll just go ahead and do an additive one, just for a little bit more extra variation. And there's no cleanup at all right here. This stuff just absolutely works. It doesn't create a bunch of extra vertices or unusable geometry. It's just good to go, plug and play. So right here, we'll just go ahead and start cutting the stuff out of the mesh. And this is the way that we did a lot of the pillars in those Doom screenshots that I showed earlier, is we just take the stuff and just start booleaning stuff out. And something interesting about Modo 10 is you can actually do this procedurally now too. So if you add this as a mesh operation, you can actually go back and start pulling this stuff around after the fact if you didn't like the first shape that you made. This is a super, super awesome workflow. You know, you don't have to go into ZBrush and worry about sculpting another version and then coming back and retopologizing that. You can just lay your UVs out on this, just cut your booleans, grab the material that results from creating those damaged edges, and then assign something else of that. So here we'll do it again on this mesh too. And you can see it's not only useful for just cutting shapes out entirely, but you can also just cut a portion of it out, and it will react just accordingly, just as you'd expect. So we'll just do one more cut right here at the top. And that's it. Go back over here into the game tab, just set some surface normals, and that's all there is to it. That's how it's the fastest way to create damaged edges and stuff that I've ever worked with. So that's it. That's it, guys. Please give this stuff a try. It's awesome.
Thanks, Connor. I must say, you make my job as a product manager really, really tough. Everything that you need is there, and you're able to take that and refine that in such a way to make it, almost down to a point where you don't even need a hotkey. You're instantly just selecting and doing. But I'll let you know, challenge accepted. We are working very hard to continue to improve a lot of those workflows, even further refine them. That's a big part of what we're focused on this year is taking those mundane steps and reducing them and letting the tool get out of the way of the artist and be more productive. So you're a great example of that. Good job. Thanks.
Thank you.